The rumble of the ferry's engine dwindled, then ceased, leaving Dean in an abrupt, profound silence that felt less like peace and more like an absence. He stood on the small, slick dock, the island a hulking, indistinct mass swallowed by the relentless fog. It wasn't a gentle mist. This was a hungry, palpable thing, tasting of salt and something colder, deeper. It clung to his coat, beaded on his eyelashes, and muffled the world until only the slosh of the tide against the barnacled pilings remained. The ferryman, a stout man whose face was etched with the island's harsh weather, merely grunted a farewell, reversed the rusty ramp, and turned the vessel back towards the unseen mainland. He was alone. Utterly, irrevocably alone. That was the point, wasn't it? His cartographer's mind, usually so precise, so ordered, felt like a map torn into confetti. This remote island, inherited from a grandfather he barely remembered, was meant to be a blank page, a place where the old lines could be erased. His boots crunched on the gravel path leading from the dock, a sound unnaturally loud in the dense air. The path wound upwards, a steep climb through gnarled, wind-stunted trees that clawed at the fog like skeletal hands. Their branches, skeletal and black, were draped with thick gray-green lichen, making them appear ancient and weary. There it was, the lighthouse keeper's cottage. It wasn't a quaint, picturesque dwelling. It was a hunkered-down, gray stone rectangle, its slate roof sagging in places, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the featureless fog. Salt spray had scoured its walls, leaving them pitted and rough. A few hardy weeds wrestled for purchase in the cracked flagstones of the small, neglected yard. A sense of profound decay hung about the place, a testament to years of neglect and the relentless battering of the sea. And behind it, towering like a monolithic forgotten god, stood the abandoned lighthouse. Its white paint was long peeled and blistered, revealing the pockmarked stone beneath. It was a skeletal finger pointed accusingly at the sky, a monument to a purpose long lost. The lighthouse didn't feel abandoned. It felt dormant, waiting. He dragged his duffel bag towards the cottage door, a heavy slab of weathered oak that groaned in protest as he pushed it open. The interior was a mausoleum of stale air and dust. The scent hit him first. A powerful cocktail of mildew, damp stone, and something else. Something vaguely metallic and briny, like old blood mixed with sea salt. He wrinkled his nose. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed off from the living for too long. Dust motes danced in the sparse light, endless, swirling galaxies of neglect. He stepped inside, his boots echoing on the bare wood. The cottage was small, comprising a main living area, a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom. Cobwebs, thick and gray, festooned every corner, draping from the low ceiling like tattered banners. The furniture, what little remained, was shrouded in white sheets, ghostly forms beneath the accumulated grime. He pulled one sheet from an armchair, revealing faded floral upholstery, stiff and brittle with age. He dropped his bag with a thud that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. He needed to air the place out, to scrub away the years of stagnation. But as he stood there, surveying the scene, a faint sound reached him. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the sea. It was a low, rhythmic thrum, barely perceptible like a distant heartbeat. He paused, tilting his head, trying to pinpoint its origin. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A vibration felt more than heard, resonating deep in the floorboards, in the very air. He dismissed it as the house settling, or perhaps the distant hum of the island's geology. Old houses made old noises. He walked to a grimy window, rubbing a clear spot with his sleeve. The fog outside was a solid wall, impenetrable. He peered harder, trying to discern the edges of the yard, the path back to the dock. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the uniform, suffocating blankness. It was just the fog playing tricks, he told himself, The exhaustion of the journey, the melancholic haze that clung to him as stubbornly as the fog clung to the island. He was determined to find solace here, to rebuild. The ferry's absence was a physical void, leaving Dean on the slick, barnacle-crusted dock. The fog, thick and saline, pressed in, a living shroud that swallowed the island whole, reducing it to a silhouette. He tightened his grip on the strap of his duffel bag, the only luggage he'd brought, and began the slow trek up the winding, overgrown path towards the cottage. Each step crunched on gravel, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the dense air. He could taste the salt, feel the damp chill seep into his bones, a constant, oppressive presence. The cottage itself was a squat, defiant structure, weathered gray wood clinging to a rocky outcrop overlooking a restless, churning stretch of water. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of salt, mildew, and something else. Something ancient and still, like forgotten dust motes dancing in sunbeams that never quite reached this place. He moved through the small rooms, his footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. The furniture was sparse, draped in yellowed sheets, like ghosts waiting for a long-dead occupant. Dean found a kerosene lamp, its glass chimney smudged, and a box of matches. The first anomaly struck him that evening. He'd made a meager meal of tinned soup, the clatter of the spoon against the bowl sounding impossibly loud in the quiet. He was a cartographer, a man who understood the precise, predictable rhythm of the world, especially the sea. Before turning in, he glanced out the window, expecting to see the tide at its usual ebb. Instead, the water was unnaturally high, churning greedily at the base of the rocks, far beyond where it should have been. The waves crashed with a hungry, sucking sound, pulling back with a force that seemed to drag stones from the shore. He pulled out a tide chart he'd packed, his brow furrowed. The numbers didn't match. Not even close. It was a fleeting thought, easily dismissed. Perhaps an unusual confluence of lunar phases or a localized atmospheric pressure system. The island was remote, after all. Logic was a fortress he'd built around himself, brick by careful brick. Dean was unrolling a fresh, blank chart on a dusty wooden table, intending to sketch the island's topography, to impose order on its wildness. He heard it first as a low hum, a resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. He paused, listening. The wind. It had to be the wind, sighing through the gaps in the old cottage's timbers. But then, it shifted, rising and falling, taking on a cadence, a subtle rhythmic pulse. It wasn't a howl or a whistle, it was a murmur, as if distant voices were speaking just beyond the reach of his comprehension. Nothing but fog and the restless sea. He pressed his ear against the cold glass, trying to discern words, a pattern. It was like listening to a song played on a deep, resonant instrument, just out of tune, just out of reach. He shook his head, rubbing his temples. Isolation, he told himself. The mind plays tricks in solitude. He spent the afternoon attempting to organize the cottage, a futile exercise in a place so thoroughly steeped in disuse. In what must have been his grandfather's study, a small, cramped room dominated by a heavy, salt-stained desk, Dean found it. Tucked beneath a stack of brittle, yellowed sea charts, in a drawer that stuck and groaned, was a leather-bound journal. It was thick, its cover warped and discolored by water damage, the pages swollen and stiff. The leather felt strangely slick, almost oily beneath his fingertips. He pulled it free, a cloud of ancient dust rising with it. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was his grandfather's, familiar yet shaky, scrawled in faded black ink. The entries were erratic, some detailed observations of weather and tides, others rambling and disjointed. Dean's eyes scanned the pages, his initial curiosity quickly giving way to a profound unease. Mixed with mundane notes were disturbing sketches, crude, swirling patterns that resembled neither currents nor constellations, but something far more alien. There were distorted, elongated forms that might have been fish, but were given too many fins, too many eyes, or limbs that ended in hooked claws. It always calls. The pact is broken. They stir. Don't listen, Dean. Don't listen to the deep song. Dean's breath hitched. He wasn't Dean. His grandfather must have been referring to someone else, another descendant, perhaps. But the name was too specific, too personal. He traced the words with a trembling finger, his cartographer's mind, so accustomed to logic and verifiable data, struggling to process the impossible. His grandfather, a man known for his stoic practicality, had written this? The unusual tide, the strange melodic cadence on the wind, and now this cryptic, terrifying journal. He tried to rationalize it again. His grandfather's isolation, the creeping onset of dementia, perhaps even a local legend he'd taken too seriously. The name, scrawled in his grandfather's familiar hand, clawed at Dean's mind. Dean. Not some other descendant, not a passing acquaintance. Him. A shiver, cold and sharp as a splinter of ice, ran down his spine, despite the cottage's perpetual damp chill. His cartographer's brain, a finely tuned instrument of logic and verifiable data, bucked against the impossibility. How could his grandfather, a man he hadn't seen in 20 years, a man whose last known address was a nursing home 2 continents away, have known he would be here, now, reading these words? The determination that had driven him to this remote island, to confront the ghosts of his past, now sharpened into a desperate need for answers. He couldn't dismiss this. He wouldn't. This was not a map with a clear legend. This was a riddle etched in bone. The next morning, Dean began his methodical search. The cottage was a repository of forgotten things, a testament to a life lived in solitary obsession. He sifted through stacks of brittle maritime charts, many depicting the treacherous currents around this very island, dotted with his grandfather's meticulous, almost neurotic annotations. He found weathered books on local flora and fauna, on navigation, on the history of isolated communities. And then, he found the more esoteric texts, slim, leather-bound volumes with titles in faded script, speaking of folklore and ancient island traditions. He spent hours hunched over a heavy, cloth-bound tome, its pages smelling of salt and mildew, titled Echoes of the Deep, Legends of the Western Isles. The print was tiny, the language archaic, but Dean's eyes, trained to decipher minute details on complex maps, found the patterns. He read of a forgotten civilization, a city swallowed by the insatiable maw of the ocean centuries ago, its ruins said to lie beneath the deepest trenches surrounding the island. The text spoke of strange, luminous creatures that occasionally washed ashore after violent storms, creatures unlike anything known to naturalists. It also hinted at ancient rites performed by the island's earliest inhabitants, rituals meant to appease something that stirred beneath the waves, a presence demanding reverence, or perhaps sacrifice. A pact, the book called it, a balance maintained through offerings. Dean's fingers trembled as he absorbed the information. The fragments of his grandfather's journal, once nonsensical ramblings, began to coalesce into a disturbing narrative. He returned to the journal, turning its pages with newfound urgency. He found an entry dated years before his own birth, tucked between seemingly innocuous observations about weather patterns. The balance shifts, the deep stirs. It remembers the pact, and it calls for what is due. Another, even older, spoke of a whisper from the abyssal dark, a sound that resonated not in the ears, but in the marrow of one's bones. The name. Prepared for what? That night, the dreams began. The ocean depths were not silent. They hummed with a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through his bones. He saw colossal, shifting shapes in the murky distance, forms that defied geometry, their outlines blurred by the water's vastness. He felt its hunger, a patient, unfathomable craving that had waited for eons. He saw bioluminescent tendrils like living constellations, weaving through the inky blackness, always drawing closer, always beckoning. The hum of the dream lingered in his ears, a phantom echo. He threw off the sodden blankets, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cottage was still, the only sound the mournful cry of a distant gull. He stumbled to the small, grimy window, needing the reassurance of the pre-dawn gray. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed it. On the sill, where only dust and spiderwebs had been yesterday, a delicate filigree of glowing green had begun to unfurl. It pulsed faintly, a soft, internal light, like miniature submerged stars. Algae, but not any algae he had ever seen. Its luminescence was unnatural, too vibrant, too alive. In the corner of the small kitchen, clinging to the chipped enamel of the sink, another patch glowed, a luminous emerald against the rust stains. He found more in the cramped bathroom, a shimmering network creeping along the grout between the tiles, emitting a faint, sweet, yet somehow metallic odor. Even the rough-hewn floorboards of the main room had tiny, almost imperceptible flecks of the bioluminescent growth, like a trail of ghostly breadcrumbs leading from the front door, through the living area, and towards the abandoned lighthouse visible through the window. The entity wasn't merely stirring beneath the waves. It was sending tendrils into his reality, marking its territory, reminding him of the pact and of what was due. The abyssal dream still clung to Dean, a cold, slick film on his skin. He'd been in the deepest dark, a place of impossible pressure where light was a forgotten concept, and something vast and unseen had pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He jolted awake, gasping for the thin, salt-laced air of the cottage. The morning light, gray and diffused through the fog-streaked panes, offered little comfort. A low thrum, barely perceptible, seemed to resonate in the ancient timbers of the cottage. He paused, head cocked. Was it the wind? The distant rumble of the ocean? No, it felt internal, a vibration against his teeth, a pressure behind his eyes. He went to the small kitchen, intent on coffee, but as he reached for the mug hanging from its hook, a small, intricate seashell, one he'd placed carefully on the windowsill yesterday, slid an inch across the sill before stopping. Dean stared at it, then at his hand, then back at the shell. The floor was level. There was no draft. He picked it up, examined it. It felt cool, ordinary. He set it back down, this time closer to the window frame. He watched it, his breath held. Nothing. He scoffed at his own jumpiness. The island was old, the cottage older. Things settled, shifted. It was not loud, but omnipresent, a dull ache behind his eardrums. He found himself pacing, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, of being heard. He passed the old, mottled mirror in the hallway, a relic from his grandfather's time. He stopped, glancing at his reflection. Then, for a fleeting, sickening moment, the reflection wavered. The lines of his jaw softened, blurred, as if seen through rippling water. He blinked, hard, and the image snapped back, his own tired face staring back at him. It was just fatigue, he told himself, a trick of the light, of his own frayed nerves. The hum intensified, a persistent, low throb that seemed to originate from beneath the floorboards, from the very bedrock of the island. It was a sound that didn't just vibrate the air, it vibrated him. Driven by a desperate need to understand, to find a source, Dean began a more thorough, frantic search of his grandfather's study. He pulled out dusty books, emptied drawers, his movements jerky. He needed to find something, anything, to explain the growing strangeness, to anchor himself to a reality that felt increasingly fluid. Behind a loose panel in the back of a built-in bookshelf, he found it. A small, lead-lined chest, its latch secured with a rusted padlock. He forced it open with a pry bar from the shed. Inside, nestled amongst dried sea herbs and polished obsidian-like stones, was a series of journals, their covers brittle with age, and a collection of crude yet unsettling drawings. The journals, written in his grandfather's cramped, precise hand, were not the logbooks Dean had found earlier. These were personal, desperate entries. His grandfather had documented strange ritualistic acts. The placement of specific stones at certain tide lines, the burning of potent, foul-smelling herbs at the new moon, the careful arrangement of dried fish and polished shells on a makeshift altar in the cottage's cellar. Sacrifices, Dean realized with a sickening lurch. Not of blood, perhaps, but of appeasement, of a desperate attempt to sate something vast and malevolent. The old ways fail. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a drawing, a relentless pull. The journals, the drawings depicting vague, tentacled shapes lurking in the depths, the words, "It calls for Dean." They coalesced into a terrifying certainty. He was being summoned. He found himself moving, not by conscious decision, but by an unseen current towards the door. The fog outside had thickened, swallowing the world beyond a few yards. The low thrumming was now a palpable force, vibrating the very ground beneath his feet, guiding him, pulling him. It was a siren song, terrible and irresistible. He walked, almost stumbled, through the swirling mist, the path to the abandoned lighthouse appearing and disappearing in the gray shroud. The iron door, rusted open, groaned a welcome. The hum was deafening here, a physical force that pressed against him, stole the air from his lungs. He could feel it now, not just hear it. A faint, sickly luminescence bloomed at the base of the central column, directly beneath the winding stairs. It wasn't light, not truly. The hum peaked, a resonant roar in his skull. And then, from the swirling, luminous gloom, something shifted. It was amorphous, vast, yet strangely defined in its lack of definition. It moved, flowing towards him with impossible speed, a silent, hungry rush. Dean scrambled back, tripping over his own feet, a choked cry escaping his throat. He fell, hitting the iron doorframe with a jarring crack, the impact momentarily stunning him. He was the target, and the game had begun. The hum in the cottage had not receded. Dean stood amidst the scattered journals and drawings, the scribbled warnings of "It calls," echoing in his mind. Fear was a cold, sharp knot in his stomach, but beneath it, a desperate resolve sparked. He had to understand. He needed to understand. He forced himself back to the scarred wooden table, the lamp casting a circle of trembling light. The journals, brittle and smelling of salt and decay, lay open before him. Dean's gaze fell upon a recurring phrase, the deep song. It appeared in entries alongside frantic sketches of the churning sea, of dark, indistinct shapes just beneath the waves. He picked up the oldest journal, its leather cover cracked like sun-baked earth. The entries here were less frantic, more observational, detailing the island's moods, the shifting tides, the unusual bioluminescence that sometimes painted the night sea. But then, a shift. It hungers. Dean's eyes scanned the page, his breath catching. The old ways. They speak of a balance, a placation. My predecessor understood. Tended it? This wasn't just about keeping a light burning for ships. The realization hit Dean with the force of a breaking wave. His grandfather wasn't just observing, he was performing a ritual. The hum in the cottage intensified, a low, guttural note that seemed to resonate within his own skull. It wasn't just auditory, it was internal. Dean pressed his hands to his temples, a dull ache blooming behind his eyes. The lamp on the table flickered, not a mechanical stutter, but a strange, organic pulse, as if its light was breathing. Was he seeing things? Or was the deep song beginning to unravel the edges of his perception? He flipped to another page, his fingers trembling. This entry was more recent, penned just weeks before his grandfather's disappearance. The song strengthens. My efforts wane. The offerings, they are not enough. It demands more. Offerings? Covenant? The term conjured images of ancient forbidden pacts, not the quiet life of a lighthouse keeper. The drawings around this entry were stark, almost crude, depicting figures. His grandfather among them, he now realized with a sickening lurch, performing what looked like a solemn, desperate dance on the rocky shore facing the turbulent sea. Tentacled forms, still vague but undeniably present, lurked in the depths of the sketches, their implied mass dwarfing the human figures. The chamber below. Another entry read, underlined multiple times, the heart of the old binding. It must be maintained. The blood. It keeps the dormancy. Dean gagged, a metallic taste in his mouth. Blood? He shoved the journal away, his chair scraping loudly across the floorboards. He could almost discern words, ancient and alien, a language of the deep that promised both oblivion and a perverse, eternal peace. His reality wavered, the sturdy walls of the cottage seeming to ripple like reflections on disturbed water. He stood, swaying, clutching the edge of the table. The floorboards beneath his feet felt strangely soft, yielding. It wasn't just discoloration. It was a subtle seam, almost perfectly fitted, running around a square section of the floor. He hadn't noticed it before, or perhaps he had dismissed it as an old repair. Dropping to his knees, Dean ran his fingers along the faint line. It was a trapdoor, cunningly disguised. He pushed and pulled, testing for a latch or handle, but found nothing. The hum throbbed, a relentless drumbeat against his eardrums, urging him on. He remembered an earlier entry about a key, not a physical one, but a sequence, a pattern. He glanced back at the journal, his eyes darting across the pages. There, a small, almost imperceptible sketch of 4 symbols, arranged in a quadrant. He recognized them from the intricate carvings on the lighthouse's base, which he had initially dismissed as mere decorative flourishes. He looked at the trapdoor again. There were 4 small, circular indentations at each corner of the hidden panel. A soft click echoed, impossibly loud in the overwhelming hum. He tried the 4th indentation. Another click. The trapdoor, with a groan of ancient wood and rusted hinges, slowly lifted a fraction of an inch. A breath of air, heavy and dank, smelling of brine, wet stone, and something else, something ancient and stagnant, wafted up. He had found the chamber, the heart of the old binding, beneath the abandoned lighthouse, and it was calling to him. The realization hit Dean with the force of a tidal wave, not crashing with immediate destruction, but pulling him under with an inexorable, cold certainty. Tended it. His grandfather hadn't merely documented the island's dark currents. He had been an active participant in their management. He had kept something at bay, or worse, fed it. A new kind of determination, grim and unyielding, settled in Dean's chest. The old man's journals, filled with cryptic observations and increasingly frantic warnings, had led him to the abandoned lighthouse. He reached the lantern room, where the massive lens lay shattered, shards of glass glinting like scattered teeth on the grimy floor. This was not where his search ended. The journals had spoken of something beneath the light, a hidden heart. Dean ran his hands over the rough-hewn stone walls, searching for any irregularity. He remembered a recurring symbol in his grandfather's later entries, a spiraling pattern, like a shell or a whirlpool, always drawn near the base of a crudely sketched lighthouse. He traced the lines of the stone blocks, his fingers catching on a faint indentation near the floor, behind what had once been the lamp operator's station. It was too subtle to be natural, a shallow, almost invisible groove that mimicked the symbol. He pressed along the groove, feeling for a give, a release. Nothing. He leaned closer, noticing a faint discoloration in the mortar. With a grunt, he He pushed against the stone block itself near the symbol. For a moment, it resisted, solid and unyielding. Then, with a low, grinding sigh, the block began to recede, sinking inward and then sliding silently to the side, revealing a gap. A narrow, descending passage, carved directly into the bedrock, stretched before him. No steps, just a ramp of rough, uneven stone, slick with moisture. He retrieved his lantern from his pack, the beam cutting a weak swathe through the gloom. The passage twisted downwards, the walls pressing in, claustrophobic and damp. Each footstep sent a small splash echoing into the unseen depths. He felt a profound isolation, cut off from the world above, swallowed by the earth. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a vast, cavernous space. Dean's lantern beam struggled to illuminate the immense chamber, its light swallowed by the sheer scale of the rock walls, dripping with brine. It wasn't an artifact, not in the sense of something crafted. It was a rent in reality, a shimmering obsidian black portal, roughly circular, pulsating with a deep internal light. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, a silent throb that Dean felt in his teeth, in the marrow of his bones. The surface of the portal was not smooth, but subtly rippled, like oil on water. Yet it was solid, impenetrable, reflecting no light, absorbing all. This was not a thing of this world, or even this dimension. It was a doorway to something vast, something impossibly ancient, a place where the very laws of existence were alien. This was the entity. As he stared, mesmerized and horrified, the violet light intensified. The rhythmic pulse quickened, thrumming through the rock, through Dean's body. His vision blurred, the cavern walls melting away, replaced by an overwhelming, terrifying vision. He saw the island, not as it was, but as it would be. The lighthouse, crumbling, submerged. The cottage, battered by impossible waves, then dissolving into the churning depths. He saw the ocean rise, not in a gentle swell, but with a predatory hunger, swallowing the land whole. The sky above was not blue or gray, but a bruised purplish black, mirroring the portal's inner light. Then, the vision shifted, narrowing, focusing on him. He saw himself, standing on the desolate shore, not as Dean, but as a vessel. His body was a conduit, a gate, through which the rising tide of oblivion would flow. He was not a victim to be consumed, but an instrument to be used. The entity didn't want to destroy him. It wanted to become him, or rather, to use him to bridge the gap between its realm and this one. The vision snapped away, leaving Dean gasping, shivering violently, his mind reeling. The portal pulsed before him, the violet light now appearing malevolent, purposeful. It was awake, and it was coming for the island. Coming for him. And now, Dean was standing directly in its path. The realization, cold and inexorable, had settled into Dean's bones. His grandfather hadn't merely observed. He had tended. The word echoed in the sudden abyssal quiet of the cottage, a leaden weight that pressed down on his chest. It wasn't just a diary of madness. It was a logbook of maintenance, a record of a terrible stewardship. A low thrum began, vibrating through the floorboards, a resonance that was too deep for the house, too vast for the island. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of brine and something else. Something metallic and utterly alien, like rust on ancient submerged iron. The walls of the small study seemed to warp, the familiar lines of the bookshelves blurring at their edges, as if the very fabric of his surroundings was becoming porous, yielding to an unseen pressure. He pressed his hands against his temples, trying to steady the world, but the tremor was inside him now, a frantic pulse that echoed the thrumming. This wasn't just the island's influence anymore. This was something more direct, more invasive. It was trying to enter. It wasn't content to merely observe or influence. It wanted a conduit, a vessel. His grandfather had kept it at bay, managed its hunger, but now the stewardship was broken and Dean was exposed. Panic, sharp and acrid, clawed its way up his throat. He stumbled backward, knocking over the rickety chair, its clatter swallowed by the omnipresent thrum. His gaze fell on the journal, still clutched in his trembling hand. His fingers, clumsy with fear, fumbled through the brittle pages. He skipped past the early entries, the meticulous observations of currents and tides, past the frantic scrawls detailing the creature's slow awakening. He needed answers, not a history lesson. His eyes darted over faded ink, dense paragraphs filled with archaic terms and fragmented sentences that hinted at rituals, at warding, at bindings. The light in the room, already dim from the perpetual fog outside, seemed to drain further, replaced by a gray, aqueous gloom that made reading a struggle. The thrum grew louder, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated the very air, making his teeth ache. Beneath it, the handwriting shifted, becoming more urgent, less legible. It spoke of a final recourse, a ceiling. He leaned closer, deciphering words like convergence, liminality, and restitution. It wasn't a complete ritual, but a fragmented series of steps, a desperate last-ditch effort. To truly seal the passage, to re-entomb the ancient horror, required a terrible balance. It wasn't just about closing a physical rift. It was about re-establishing a cosmic debt, a payment. "The debt demands its due," one line read. "A life for a life, a soul for a gate." Dean's breath hitched. A life? A soul? What did that even mean? Was it a symbolic offering, or something far more literal, far more gruesome? He read on, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of the cryptic language. The final, stark sentence, scrawled in thick, desperate strokes, brought him up short. Only through the ultimate severance can the true binding be forged. The anchor must be cut, irrevocably. The ultimate severance. The anchor. He thought of the island, his grandfather's devotion to it, his own arrival here seeking a new beginning. The entity wasn't just demanding a life, it was demanding something deeply personal, something that would tear away the last vestiges of himself. It wasn't a simple sacrifice. It was an immolation of self, a complete and utter eradication of what made him him. The walls of the study visibly rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. The journal, heavy in his hands, was no longer a guide to escape, but a ledger of an impossible choice. The island groaned under the weight of the entity's fury. The sky, once a familiar canvas of gray and muted blue, had bled into a bruised, purpling bruise, pressed low against the churning slate of the sea. Wind, a living, tangible force, tore at the cottage, rattling the window panes with a violence that went beyond mere weather. It wasn't a storm. It was a shriek, drawn out and unending. A psychic manifestation of the abyssal hunger Dean now understood. He stood by the cold hearth, the leather-bound journal clutched in hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the immense, chilling clarity that had settled upon him. The cryptic passages, once maddeningly obscure, now laid bare their terrible truth. The anchor, the severance. They weren't metaphors for some abstract concept. They were a blueprint for a sacrifice, a binding. And the cost, the ultimate price, would be his own. Outside, the island was twisting into a grotesque parody of itself. Dean had seen it on his desperate forays for supplies, for the specific, seemingly innocuous items detailed in his grandfather's scrawled notes. The gulls, usually raucous and scavenging, flew in erratic, silent patterns, their wings beating against an invisible current. Their cries were no longer the sharp calls of birds, but ragged, guttural chokes swallowed by the wind. The familiar coastal floor had begun to contort, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers, their leaves shimmering with an unnatural, oily sheen. It pressed against his eardrums, a constant low thrum that vibrated through his bones, a direct assault on his sanity. But Dean wouldn't break. Not now. The knowledge gleaned from the journal, the understanding of the deep pact and its terrible demands, had forged a new resolve within him. His grandfather had known this day would come, had prepared for it, had left the tools for him to finish what he could not. He moved through the cottage, his movements precise, deliberate. He packed them carefully into a worn canvas satchel, alongside a storm lantern and a small, rusted compass. The compass was a relic from his grandfather's seafaring days, its needle now spinning wildly, unable to find true north in the maelstrom of the entity's influence. It was a stark reminder of how completely the natural order had been subverted. His gaze fell upon a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. A smiling face, vibrant and full of life, now only a ghost. His profound personal tragedy, the wound that had driven him to this desolate place, suddenly felt both distant and agonizingly close. This was the true cost, he realized, his breath catching in his throat. The entity didn't just want his life. It wanted the memory of his life. It wanted to sever him from his past, from his grief, from the very essence of what made him Dean. The counter-ritual wasn't just a binding, it was an erasure. He would become the anchor, yes, but in doing so, he would lose the very foundation of his own identity, the memories that defined him, the pain that had shaped him. He would be untethered, a blank slate, forever bound to the island, but empty within. A wave of nausea washed over him, not from fear of death, but from the horrifying prospect of ceasing to be himself. To lose the memory of his love, of his loss, that was a death far more profound. Yet, the alternative was the island's complete annihilation, its inhabitants swallowed by the deep. The choice, brutal and absolute, was no choice at all. The abandoned lighthouse, that solitary sentinel on the island's highest point, was his destination. It was the nexus, the place where his grandfather had performed his own desperate acts of defiance. It was where Dean would enact the final, terrible counter-ritual. The wind howled outside, a hungry, limitless sound. A grim understanding settled in his chest. His grandfather had left him the journal, the knowledge, and the burden. As he reached for the cottage door, a sudden violent tremor shook the foundations, rattling every dish on the shelves, sending a shower of dust from the ceiling. It was the entity, sensing his intent, gathering its forces, preparing for the ultimate confrontation. The pressure intensified, a vice clamping down on his skull. He tasted copper in his mouth. Dean pushed the door open, bracing against the gale. The world outside was a maelstrom of unnatural weather, a churning vortex of wind and spray and the entity's palpable rage. The path to the abandoned lighthouse would be treacherous, a gauntlet of psychological and physical assaults. But he would walk it, and he would pay it with himself. Wind, a living, tangible force, tore at the cottage, rattling the window panes with a violence that promised to shatter glass and splinter wood. Dean stood on the threshold, the wind a physical blow against his chest, urging his back. But there was no turning back. Not now. He stepped out, the gale snatching at his oilskin, threatening to rip it from his shoulders. Rain, thick and cold, lashed his face, blinding him in torrents. The path to the abandoned lighthouse was a treacherous, uneven ribbon of rock and mud, now slick and treacherous. Each step was a battle against the elements, against the unseen hand that seemed to push him, to throw him off balance. He stumbled, catching himself on a jagged outcrop, his knuckles scraping raw. The air tasted of salt and something else, something metallic and sharp, like ozone mixed with the scent of a deep-sea cavern laid bare. The abandoned lighthouse loomed ahead, a skeletal finger against the bruised sky, its broken lantern room a gaping maw. It was a beacon, not of safety, but of the encroaching horror. The very structure of the lighthouse seemed to warp at the edges of his vision, its stone dissolving into something fluid and impossible, only to snap back into rigid granite. He shook his head, trying to clear the distortions, but they persisted, flickering at the periphery. The heavy door, already ajar, groaned on rusted hinges as the wind tore at it. Dean pushed it open, stepping into the circular antechamber. The air inside was still and heavy, devoid of the storm's fury, yet infinitely more oppressive. It reeked of brine and decay, but also something ancient, something that had never known the sun. The spiral staircase, a dizzying ascent of cast iron, spiraled upwards into the gloom. He began his climb, his boots clanking on the metal steps. With each turn of the spiral, the pressure increased. This was the attack, the psychological assault the journal had warned of. Finally, he reached the lantern room. It was not empty. The glass panels were mostly shattered, letting in the full, furious howl of the storm, but the space itself was distorted. The air shimmered, thick and viscous, as if reality itself was struggling to maintain its form. It was not black, nor any color he knew. It was an absence, a hungry aperture that seemed to drink the light, the sound, the very air. From its impossible depths emanated the crushing pressure, the wrongness that had permeated the island. This was the portal, fully opened, fully manifested. His grandfather's scrawled notes flashed through his mind. To sever the link, a part of what binds it must be returned. Not life, not blood, but a tether of the heart, the strongest tether. He understood now. The entity fed on grief, on despair, on the unmoored sorrow that had haunted him since his tragedy. His grandfather had made a pact, not to destroy it, but to contain it, to feed it small, controlled offerings of despair from the island's broken-hearted. But Dean's own overwhelming grief had become a feast, an anchor that allowed the entity to fully manifest. The ritual wasn't about a physical offering, but a release, a severing. He had to give up his grief, not to heal, but to weaponize it, to cut the tether. You want it? Dean's voice was a raw, defiant rasp against the wind's shriek. He clutched the wooden carving, feeling its heat against his palm. Take it then. Take all of it. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to confront the memory that haunted him most. The last time he saw his loved one, the argument, the unspoken words, the final regretful glance. He let the pain wash over him, not fighting it, but embracing its full, agonizing weight. He remembered the smell of her hair, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her hand in his. All the beautiful, heartbreaking fragments of a life lost. He gathered them, every sharp edge, every tender curve, every tear-soaked moment, into a single burning core within him. This was the sacrifice. To cut the cord, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. The tendrils recoiled, hissing, and the impossible colors of the portal began to flicker, to shrink. The crushing pressure eased, replaced by a sudden jarring emptiness. He had done it, but the cost was immeasurable. The agonizing offering had been made. It was a severing, yes, but not a release. He slumped against the damp, salt-encrusted wall of the abandoned lighthouse, the rough stone biting into his shoulder blades through his soaked jacket. The deep song had receded, not vanished, not entirely silenced, but drawn back, like a tide pulling away from the shore after a storm. What remained was a low, resonant thrum, a vibration that felt less like an external threat and more like a new, unsettling rhythm within his own bones. The air, thick with the scent of brine and decaying metal, now also held a faint metallic tang, like old blood mixed with ozone. He could almost taste it on his tongue, a ghost of a flavor that made his stomach clench. His eyes, wide and unfocused, scanned the cavernous interior of the abandoned lighthouse. The massive, tarnished Fresnel lens above him, a relic of a bygone era, seemed to watch him with a blind, knowing gaze. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak gray light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the rust-pitted machinery, the spiral staircase winding upwards into perpetual gloom. Every creak of the ancient structure, every drip of condensation from the ceiling, was amplified in the profound stillness that had fallen. A tremor ran through him, not of fear, but of an awful, dawning comprehension. The offering hadn't banished the entity. It had merely changed the relationship. He pushed himself away from the wall, his limbs heavy, each movement an effort of will. His gaze drifted to the circular platform where the lamp mechanism sat, its gears frozen in time. A faint, almost imperceptible glow emanated from beneath the massive lens, not the bright, focused beam of a working light, but a diffuse, phosphorescent pulse, like the bioluminescence of some deep-sea creature. He dragged himself closer, his boots scraping on the grit-covered floor. The pulse intensified as he approached, a soft, rhythmic beat that synchronized with the new thrum in his chest. There, etched into the rust-colored casing, almost swallowed by decades of neglect, he saw them. Not carvings, not symbols, but a series of interconnected lines, a crude, yet intricate map. It wasn't a map of the island or the coastline, and at its center, where the light source should have been, a single deep impression, perfectly circular, the size of a man's palm. He felt a pull, an undeniable urge to press his hand into that indentation. It was as if his own flesh remembered the shape, a phantom sensation of belonging. He hesitated, his mind screaming a warning, but his body moved without his conscious command. His palm settled into the depression. It was a reveal that shattered the last vestiges of his former self. His grandfather hadn't built this lighthouse to warn ships away from the entity. He hadn't even built it to contain it. A focal point. The light, when it shone, didn't illuminate the waters for safety. It beckoned. It guided. It fed. His grandfather's pact hadn't been one of defiance, but of grim cooperation. A bargain struck out of desperation, or perhaps a terrifying form of reverence. The lighthouse keeper was not a protector, but a facilitator. A voice. And Dean, with his profound personal loss, his raw, unchanneled grief, had presented the perfect, agonizing offering to inherit that mantle. The entity didn't want his sorrow to be severed. It wanted it to be channeled, to become a part of the deep song. He was not free, he was bound. The cost was not his sanity, not in the traditional sense, but his very autonomy. He was the new keeper, not of the light, but of the connection. The lighthouse was not his sanctuary. It was his prison and his purpose. He pulled his hand away from the mechanism, the phosphorescent glow fading slightly. He walked to one of the grimy windows, peering out into the perpetual fog. The waves crashed against the distant rocks with a new, mournful cadence. He saw the faint outline of his cottage, a solitary, insignificant speck on the desolate island. He was something else entirely. A bridge, an echo, a vessel. The immediate threat was neutralized, yes. The deep song would not consume him, not now. But he understood it. He felt it. He would listen. He would learn. And he would become the voice that guided the forgotten things from the deep, an unwitting instrument in a cosmic orchestration he could only begin to comprehend. And as the distant, mournful cry of a gannet pierced the fog, Dean knew with a certainty that froze his blood that he was utterly, irrevocably alone, yet never truly alone. The deep song was his now.